Okay, fine. So yesterday we started the discussion of whether when you have daughters Yerusha, is it unique in the way sons Yerusha is or not? And we noted how the Gemara in Daf Kuf Yud, some of the Havaminas point very strongly in the direction that sons and daughters could be equivalent. Some focus very strongly in the opposite direction, and the Maskana is ambiguous in that sense. Yay, fine. But there does seem to be some other Gemara that's a little bit less ambiguous. So let's see. So let's go back to Kuf Tet. And one of the things I think I hope you notice. I mentioned this at the beginning of Yesh Nochlan, but you're probably seeing it. A lot of Yesh Nochlan is just in the Gemara, meaning we've actually done like everything from Kuf Tet Amud Aleph to this point in Kuf Tet, and then we did Kuf Yud, and now we're going to continue in Kuf Tet. It's a lot of Gemara. The Lamdas is very much in the Gemara itself. So let's look at 5 lines from the bottom, which is actually where we left off when we were on Kuf Tet last. Darash Rabbi Yishmael b'Rabbi Yossi. Ish ki yamut uven ein lo. If a person dies and he has no son, b'makom bas ata ma'avir nachala min ha'av. V'i ata ma'avir nachala min ha'av b'makom achin. What does that mean? The Gemara says, "B'makom bat," when there's a daughter, ata ma'avir nachala min ha'av.
Okay, so
you pass the Yerusha on.
This is like a cognatic view of inheritance. But like, and then, so when you have an exclusive, so when there is only a, but and then like cognatic, like, is it okay? We get like they get you.
I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
He's playing a video game right now called Crusader Kings 2.
He's playing a video game called Crusader Kings 2, okay? I'm trying to follow this, so
in the base game, you have your own legal description, but inheritance laws. Yeah, so you pick.
So you're learning the vocabulary from.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
So there's primogeniture, there's like full geniture, there's seniority, and then there's also gender discussion, which says agnatic, dogmatic, and cognatic, and also based on.
Okay, I really don't want anything fancy. What does the Gemara say? Fine.
The daughters can inherit.
What?
The daughters will inherit from.
The daughters. Okay, clearly this line says the daughters inherit, but that's not what I'm worried about, guys. Language here. What does the Gemara say? You have see, you're giving me the upshot. The upshot is daughters inherit before fathers, right? That's the upshot. But what does the Gemara actually say?
It passes over the father.
It passes over the father. Thank you, Ezra. Right? Ezra says, wait a second. It's true that the upshot of the Gemara is that when there's a son, it goes to the son. But if there's a daughter, it goes to the daughter, not the father. But the Gemara says it in a very roundabout way, which is, if there is a daughter, then you pass over the father for his legitimate inheritance and give it to the daughter. Now, that is a very odd formulation. What does that formulation even mean, Ezra?
Would you say that a father would go for another son from that?
I mean, I don't know what you would say, but
because it seems like the normal.
I mean, halachically, no, but I just want you to describe what do the words seem to mean.
Okay.
Ezra got it. Now, Ezra, spell it out. What do the words sound like?
It means the natural way it should go to the father.
Yes, right? It sounds like the Gemara is saying, look, logically, you would have said son, father. But if there's a daughter, so what can you do? You give it to the daughter, and you pass over the father. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but in the question of are daughters like sons, what does this Gemara seem to say? No, because no one ever said when there is a son, you pass over the father for the son. When there's a son, the son gets it, because obviously the son gets it, right? And yet daughters, even though it's true that in the end of the day we say daughters come after sons, the Gemara phrases it as if this is like you know, the unnatural way of the world. Now, we're going to continue the Gemara, and we're going to get back to the Yerushalmi, but before we do that, I want to read you just one line in the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi is more radical, because Yerushalmi also focuses on this word v'ha'avartem, but it says as follows: K'tiv, ish ki amuru v'ein lo v'ha'avartem v'nachalato levido. If a man dies, you give the inheritance to his son. If there's no son, you give it to the daughter. Tani Rabbi Shmuel, Shina katuv nachalazot mikol nachalot. The Torah changed this inheritance from the other. K'tiv, ish ki amuru v'ein lo. Sorry. K'tiv u'netatem v'kan katuv v'ha'avartem. Normally it says give, here it says v'ha'avartem. So in the Bavli, what does the word ha'avara seem to mean? To pass over, right? The Yerushalmi says ibur hadin hu shedei abat yoreshet. What's ibur hadin? Something like it is a travesty of justice. It is an act of injustice. Yes, meaning this is not justice. It's not just like, yes, like the Torah commands that you do this like non-justice thing. Meaning it's an even stronger language. Meaning the Bavli, in a weaker language, Yerushalmi seeming stronger language, seem to both say that Yerusha Habat, the fact that a daughter gets over her father, while it's true, is not natural, not just. Right? So, while we had ambiguity in the Gemara yesterday, if I asked you just based on these lines to guess whether Yerusha Habat is, when it happens, equivalent to the unique status of Yerusha Haben or not, what would you guess? No, right? No, meaning it happens, but like really by right, it goes to father first, and the daughter is like there's a kasuv. But it really does seem to push the Yerusha of a daughter is not like this natural inheritance like a son. And the Gemara then continues, right? Right? You don't pass over the father when they're brothers, but you do when there's a daughter. But still, like it's comparing it to other Yerushas, and like at some level, it's saying father makes more sense than daughter. Halacha it doesn't, but like conceptually it does. So the Gemara says, maybe all it means is that when there are daughters, you take it away from the brothers, but you in fact give it to the father. And you don't give it to the father. So then he says, then it shouldn't say v'ha'avartem. Why not?
They wouldn't have been brothers. Okay.
What? So the Gemara says, how do you know that it means you're skipping over the father? Maybe it means you're skipping over the brothers, but you're not skipping over the father. So what's the answer? The Gemara says, then it shouldn't have said v'ha'avartem. It should have said unitatem. What does that line even mean? How does the fact that it didn't say nitatem prove, and it said v'ha'avartem prove anything? How does it prove that it's not going to the brothers? Right? Like what? How did we get there? Right? Did you even bother asking yourself this question? Come on. What? I just said, read the Gemara carefully. What does the Gemara say? What does that mean? The Gemara says, if it meant that it's brother's son's father, daughter, brother, then it should have said not v'ha'avartem. And according to Rabbi Gershom, it should have said unitatem. Why, if it was son, father, daughter, brother, would it say unitatem? And if it says son, daughter, father, brother, it says v'ha'avartem. Ah, thank you. Very good. That's exactly what it seems to me, which is the Gemara takes it as a given that brothers are more distant relatives. And therefore, the fact that a daughter gets it before a brother is is not in any way a perversion of justice, it's not a chiddush, and therefore you would just list it and say, give it to sons, give it to daughters, give it to, right? Give it to brothers. But if it says, no, pass over to give it to daughters, then it does seem to mean that it's passing over someone who, by right, is closer. Now, why is that true? So the Gemara seems to be assuming that fathers, there's a svara to say fathers are closer, but not brothers. Why would that be true? Probably because, as we've seen, vertical relationships are taken more seriously in this regard. But that's exactly the point, right? Meaning, there's no havamina that a brother, which is a horizontal relationship, is going to come before a daughter. But a father who is also vertical, it's a chiddush that you give it to the daughter instead of the father, and therefore it can be viewed as passing over. But horizontal relationships are not closer.
But, like, isn't, like, the public is, the whole, like, story says that, like, you need a public to say that daughters come before fathers and brothers. I would say that that's even more.
No, not fathers, brothers. We haven't done fathers, brothers. Meaning that not yet. We've done fathers and brothers, not fathers, brothers.
Is there any way of saying that?
Fathers, brothers are last on that list.
But is there any way of saying that they're closer than brothers? No.
No.
Right.
Oh, no.
But you need a public to say that daughters come before fathers, brothers, meaning that you.
Well, no. The pasuk just tells you daughters, brothers, fathers, brothers, and the Xeris HaKasav puts the father in between daughter and brother, right? The Torah says son, daughter, brother, father's brothers. It says nothing about father. The drasha inserts father between daughter and brother.
Okay.
Right? The Gemara assumes, is not yet trying, it doesn't think it's a chiddush kind of rad yet, but it doesn't seem to think it's a chiddush that daughters go before uncles. Or that's not father's brothers, right? That's not a chiddush, right? What the Gemara is trying to figure out is why is the Yerusha of a daughter describes the word ha'avartem, and the Gemara seems to think that ha'avartem means that there's something unnatural happening when you give it to the daughter instead of somebody else. Question is, who is that somebody else? So the Gemara says fathers, and then the Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe it's brothers, but the father really does go before the daughter, because remember, father doesn't appear explicitly in the pasuk, and therefore we don't know where to put father, right? And the Gemara says no, because it says ha'avartem, and doesn't explain anymore.
How is it like natural to say that daughters come before brothers if you need it's necessary for the
so that's exactly right. Meaning again, the Gemara doesn't seem to prove it. The Gemara seems to assume it. Well, you're right. How do you know? Maybe not. But the Gemara seems to assume that it is true.
But on the fact that we need this story to tell us that brother. I mean that brother. Like if we need the story that.
We need a story to tell you the daughters inherit. Right? Once you're teaching how the daughters inherit, you give us the whole list. It's not clear that every line there is a chiddush, right? It's not that every single there is a chiddush compared to daughter, right? That's not clear. The Gemara does think the word ha'avartem tells you that giving to daughters is in some way a chiddush, right? And is taking away from someone who might have thought is more closely related. But the Gemara seems to not even really have a deep havamina that that's brothers. But the Gemara did have a havamina that it's fathers. Presumably because of some sort of preference for vertical relationships rather than horizontal ones. But from all of this discussion, it sounds like pretty clear that everything in the Gemara is pushing in the direction of saying that daughters are not sons. Right? Because sons obviously go first. That no one even had to tell you. The only question is, okay, fathers, daughters, who really deserves it, maybe fathers sort of deserve it, but you don't give it to them. Brothers, it's obvious, right? But daughters are part of the conversation with the rest of the Yerushim, not sons. So the Gemara says, "Ulaman denaflam nevavartem hay she'ero mayavid le." So if you learn about vartem, then what does she'ero teach? Because she'ero was the pasuk we used to teach that fathers inherit at all. So she'ero, l'chiditanya she'ero zu ishto. That's going according to the shita that your wife inherits, that you inherit from your wife. Malamed kabal yoresh ishto. Uleman denafkulam nishero hay bartem mayav. Like you the Chania Rebbe Amar Bechul Nemer Benetina Vekan Nemer Benan Avara Shein Lachasham Avir Nachala Mishevet Leshevet Abat. So if you don't want to darshan it this way, then what does the Havartem teach you? If She'erot teaches fathers, what does the Havartem? Havartem just teaches you that daughters are the only ones who, because they who can theoretically end up making your property transfer to another Shevet, as we saw in the case of the Benot Slavcha. Okay? Good? Good. So this Gemara, like I said, really does sound like it's going in the direction. Did I really say to the two dots? I'm sorry. It's a lot. I don't think I meant that. Oh, no. I'm sorry. I didn't do that. Right. I did that in the previous structure. Here, I only wanted to go with you a few lines. Good. Now I don't feel bad. But again, I think that the simple implication of this Gemara really is that whatever exactly you think about why brothers and fathers, etc., the fact that the Gemara assumes sons go first, and after that, it could be fathers, it could be daughters. At some level, it's an injustice, as the Yerushalmi would have it, that it goes to daughters over father. It very much militates against the notion that daughters, even once they inherit, are the same as sons, right? Because it's not, right? The conversation is between sons, fathers, daughters, fathers, brothers, and which of them by right inherits and which of them actually inherits. But sons aren't even part of this conversation, right? I think that's like the simple implication here. And the Yerushalmi, as we said, is even more radical, that at some level it's an injustice that daughters inherit instead of brothers, of fathers. Okay, let's go back to the Yerushalmi. So now go back to the Yerushalmi, second line. The Yerushalmi now quotes the Chachmei Ha'akum. The non-Jews, and we'll see this in the Bavli later on, the non-Jews say, Chachmei Ha'akum omrim benu bat shavin. Ka'achat. Sons and daughters are equivalent, they both inherit. Di'inun darshe uven ein lo ha'em yesh lo shnein shavin. And the way they darshan is that if there's a son and a daughter, so then they are equivalent. The Gemara says, "V'hatevon," really? V'achtivim ein lo, but ha'em yesh lo shnein shavin. V'atun modin delete bar of hachalete bar. So the second half of the pasuk is clearly talking about a case where there is no son, right? Obviously, because if there's no son and there's no daughter, so then it goes to the brother. It goes to the father. The pasuk says brother, right? Which means that you understand that this is a case where there is no son. So why do you read the case of daughter as there is a son and a daughter and they're splitting it equally? And therefore Chazal rejects the drush of the Chachmei Akum. Hadstukin omrin, but haben v'habat shnein shavin. Granddaughter from your son is equivalent to daughter. How do they get that? The inun darshe, because they darshan ma bat bino, haba'a mikoach b'nei yorashteni. If my grandchild, through my son inherits, who's a second generation from me, biti haba'a mikochi eino din shetirasheni, shouldn't my daughter definitely inherit? Now, this is something we'll get to, but what is the logic of these psukim?
Indirect versus direct.
Correct, right? Is that more than that, meaning what?
Meaning if
the
granddaughter inherits indirectly through the...
Okay, I would actually argue that it's the opposite of that. Meaning, they argue that if your grandchild inherits, and obviously your child inherits because your grandchild is closer, right? But what do we respond? No, that doesn't work. Why not? Because the daughter would have to inherit from her grandfather. The daughter has to inherit from the... What's the response? That the granddaughter, through the son, inherits from her father, not from you. Meaning, what seems to be the machlokes between the Sukkin and Chazal? Whether when your grandchild inherits, it's direct or indirect. Meaning, if you think it's direct, so then there's an argument to be made that your grandchild is not as close as your child. But if it's indirect, meaning your grandchild doesn't inherit directly from you, they inherit from your son, right, and it passes down generation to generation, then if your son becomes from your daughter, then your granddaughter comes before your daughter also, because it already went to your son. Right? Talmud Lomar, the where it says, well, we prove it from the fact that a daughter can inherit from both mother and father, and therefore mix around things in Shvatim, which shows you that they're inheriting, etc. Fine. But at any rate, in the Yerushalmi, like in the Bavli, what are the implications in terms of the Yerusha of the daughter, especially in terms of a rejection of the drasha of the Tzedukin, that daughters are not unique, right? If you think about it, Chazal explicitly reject even the possibility that your daughter comes before your granddaughter, if your granddaughter comes from your son, because your son is unique, and therefore, by going through your son, it gives your granddaughter more power than your own daughter, right? We actually reject the drasha. This appears in Bavli also, right? But what does that show? Seemingly that sons are the key, not children. Right? And therefore, your granddaughter actually has more rights than your daughter. Because your granddaughter, through your son, inherits the power from her father. And her father is more powerful than your daughter. Meaning your son, her father, is more powerful than your daughter in terms of Yerusha.
The daughter inherits directly from the primary source.
Correct. And Dafka, in this case, that we can serve. Right? The daughter gets it from the grandfather, but since there was a son, she doesn't get it. And now the granddaughter gets it from her father, who was a son to the grandfather, who therefore inherited. I get that was a little bit confusing. Okay. Let's try yet another, right? I know I'm just showing you different implications, but I think the simplest read of this Bavli in Yerushalmi is that daughters are not equivalent to sons. Okay, what about the following midrash? Look at this midrash. Vatikravna benot Slavchad. The daughters of Slavchad came. Kevan sheshamu benot Slavchad sha'aretz mitchaleket lishvatim lizacharim v'lo nekevot. When the daughters of Slavchad heard that Israel was going to be divided to the shvatim through the males and not the females, nitkabtzu kulam. They got together, zu. Litol Eitzah. They got together to come up with a plan. And here was their plan. Amar, I mentioned this midrash to you before. Lo kirachamei basar v'adam rachamei makom. God's mercy and human mercy are not the same. Basar v'adam racham aval skarim. Yoter v'nanekevot. Human beings always prefer males to females. But God, who created the world, is not like that. God has mercy on men, God has mercy on women, God has mercy on all creatures. He even gives it to animals. God actually has mercy, and therefore he's not going to be misogynistic, and he's going to give it to us, unlike human beings who always prefer males to females. Okay. Someone parse that midrash for me and tell me what it does or does not tell us about Yerusha of the daughters. Yaakov.
It says men are
Okay, well, obviously there's the feminist read here, which is, you see that fighting for equality is godly, and fighting for male, right, is what human beings do. Yes, that's the classic read of this midrash, but that's really not relevant. That's not relevant for our point right now. And therefore, but what's the conclusion about the inheritance of daughters? So equivalent to sons or not? Okay, so one way of reading this midrash is the way Yaakov reads it, which is, human beings might prefer males, but the chiddush is that God doesn't. And therefore, when God gives the laws that daughters indeed inherit, what he's telling you is your automatic preference for boys over girls is wrong. Now, what's the obvious problem with that read? Because there still is a preference. right? Okay, so you'd have to have an attenuated read, which is, yes, boys still come first, but the fact that God insists that daughters inherit right after sons tells you that he might think that they're like sons just have precedence as opposed to human beings who would want to discount them entirely. But Lamaskana, no. When daughters inherit, they really are like sons, and that's what God teaches you. Okay? Fine. That would be an attenuated read. But there's another way of reading this Midrash. What's the other way of reading this Midrash?
I answered the question, but you can inherit the flaws on actual symbols.
Well, maybe, but that's not the point for now. There's certainly another way for the purpose of daughters, right? How else might you read this? And I hadn't thought of this, but when I was listening to Rav Shimoni's shir, he had a very different read of this, a very radical read of this Midrash, or maybe not radical, I don't know. A different read than Yaakov, which points in the exact opposite direction than Yaakov, right? And that is, he said, read it carefully. It's a very careful read, according to the Midrash, what principle dictates that daughters inherit?
They are like sons. No,
Nope. What principle drives the inheritance of daughters, according to the Midrash? Mercy. Not, very specifically, not what?
Law.
Right, law or justice. Meaning, think about the Midrash. They go to God because God has mercy on girls just like he does on animals. And therefore, he won't leave us out in the cold. But that, if you take it seriously, means similar to what we saw in the Bible in the Yerushalmi, which is, at some level, the fact that daughters get it is not a function of justice or law, right? It's an expression of God's mercy. And if you take that literally, you might say, yeah, because at some level, that's not what should happen. God has mercy and therefore allows girls when there's no sons to inherit, but it's not the same as boys, because boys don't inherit because of mercy. They inherit by right. Now, obviously, how could you negate this read and go back to Yaakov?
No.
Well, Rachman doesn't come under the pasuk.
The men of the world also have mercy.
Okay, good. So one way is Rami, which is to say, wait a second. No, the Benot Slopson and the Midrash are saying that because men have mercy on other men, that's why they rule in their favor in court, right? Which means that, right? Meaning, this doesn't necessarily mean it's mercy and it's not law. It means that people's sentiments affect the way they adjudicate law. What they're saying is that God is not biased towards men when he adjudicates law. Right? Or a variation on that is, or a variant on that would simply be that, no, God's mercy is what drives him to institute law in a certain way. Meaning, this is not mercy like God's doing you a favor. God is merciful, and therefore his law reflects mercy. Right? Okay, so Rami just says maybe this just teaches you that inheritance has nothing to do with law. It's all like mercy and the way God deals with the world, and therefore you can prove absolutely nothing from this. Good, so I'm not really sure this Midrash proves anything, meaning because, sure, you could read Rachamim as saying like, oh, that's not really what should happen, but we'll give it to daughters, but you could also read it as saying, no, just like men, when they judge, are motivated by their emotions, so to speak, right? God's, quote-unquote, obviously, I'm not being anthropopathic here, I mean, I am, but I don't mean it, right? God's emotions, right, lead him to a different type of justice, or you just say, no, God's rachamim, whatever it means, is what motivates the way the Torah is formulated, and therefore this is law, and therefore you come back to Yaakov's read, and therefore I'm not sure you can prove anything from this Midrash. All right, I don't know. I mean, I originally was inclined towards Yaakov's read, which is human beings think that it only goes to boys. God is machadesh, it also goes to daughters, and maybe that means that daughters are given to sons, maybe not, right? this read, which is saying, no, yes, God gives it to daughters, but that's an act of mercy and not law, that's a bit much for me. It does happen to be, it does happen to be what the Yerushalmi and the Babli say in terms of ha'avara, but I don't know if that's what this line in the Midrash actually means. Okay, I brought it up. You don't have to like it. Fine. Okay. So before we look at Tosfot, I think in the end of the day, the biggest halachic proof, though, one was what we already saw, which was the case of Kiddushin, right? The case in Kiddushin, not of Kiddushin, in Kiddushin of Evet Ivri. But remember, Ezra, what was the Gemara from which Evet Ivri was derived? Was Te'achuzah. What is that Gemara about Te'achuzah? That's the Gemara here in Erechin Daf Chavei. The Gemara in Erechin says as follows: Taner Rabbanan. So remind me, what was the case? I think it was Eli who read it for us the first time. What is the case of Te'achuzah?
Oh, it has to do with the Kohanim, whether they take the land or you will.
Right. If you're Makdish land, so then if you redeem it, it doesn't go to the Kohanim. But if someone else buys it, then at Yovel, when it returns to the Kohanim and not to the person whose ancestral land it was. Yes? So,
understand is like the reality behind it, or you make in terms of this in this context, I mean, you know that it's like the son who was.
okay, right. So however, right, the Gemara had said that not only can you redeem it to prevent it from turning into perpetual property of Kohanim, but who else can do it? The son, right? So Taner Rabbanan, Im lo yigal esadeh bailim, right? If he doesn't redeem the land, meaning the owner, v'im machar esadeh, and if he sells the land, who's that? Gizbar. That's the representative of the Beit HaMikdash. Now the Gemara says, li'ish acher, to somebody else, le'acher v'lo leben. To others, but not the son. If he sells it to the son, then it's like selling it to the original owner, and therefore it reverts back to the original owner in Yovel and not to the Kohanim. Right? So, in order to redeem it, to prevent it from going to the Kohanim perpetually, you have two options. Either you redeem it yourself, or your son redeems it. Correct? Yes? You're with me? So now the Gemara says, how do you know that the person who shares the power of the person himself is his son? Maybe it's the brother who is not, right, who's close enough of a relative to you that he can take your place in redeeming the land. He says, no, Kishu Omer Ish, Hare Achamor. No, that's Ish. Hamani Mekayim Acher, Velo Leben. What we learn from Acher is not sons, meaning brothers are others, sons are not others. And just like it asks in several other contexts we've seen, Uma Ra'ita L'Rabot Rabein, Ulahotzi Et Ach. Why do you think that sons get to be you and not somebody else? But brothers are automatically, quote unquote, somebody else. Answer: Marbe ani raben shekeim tachat aviv liyadau evet ivri. Because sons take the role of their father for yud and evet ivri, as we already saw in Kiddushin. Adarabba, marbe ani ra'ach shekeim kam tachat achiv liyibum. Brothers are the ones who take your place for yibum. And what was the Gemara's answer, as we've seen several times? No, klum yesh yibum el makom she'en ben. Hayesh ben ein yibum. Yibum is only as a replacement of a son, but if there's a son, you don't do yibum. 2 verses 1 says no. Mishum David Ivri ma'ai perchanami denafkale. Klum yesh yibum el makom she'en ben. He says Evet Ivri itself is derivative of yibum. But now the Gemara asks, Boy, Rabba bar Avua, but mahu shetamid sadeh le'aviha. Can a daughter establish, right? Can the daughter keep the land in her father's property? Now, if I ask you conceptually, what's the question?
So, the status that a son has, what is it about the son that allows him to pick the land that,
He is not considered an acher. He considered you.
Yeah.
Right, as we've seen many times, and that's where we come up with this formulation that a ben is a mamale makom and not just a yoresh. Right, that seems to be almost explicit in the Gemara. But now the Gemara says, but what about daughters? What seems to be the conceptual question? Is if that we've established at the end of the day what we need for Evet Ivri, what we need for Se'al Chuzah is something greater than a yoresh, a mamale makom. So now the Gemara says, okay, we've established that if we're going to define between sons and brothers, one of them as you, and one of them as somebody else, who takes your place? Your son, not your brother. And now the Gemara comes and asks, well, what about daughters? What seems to be the question? Right, we know that daughters come, that sons come before daughters, but when daughters inherit, are they potential mamali makom or not? Such that if a daughter, now this is not, right, this is really going farther. It's saying, right, let's formulate it more sharply. What is it saying? Because is this a direct case of inheritance? No, it's who can redeem the field and keep it within your property. Therefore, you're asking directly the question, not the nature of their inheritance, but directly, what are they asking? Is a daughter your mimale makom or not? Right? Meaning, is a daughter defined as an acher or you? Right?
Yeah, I mean, community language that we used previously, our them on the father, you go to the daughter. That that inheritance, passed over the father, goes to the daughter. Right. So from that Gemara, we already medayek that it sounds like that a daughter is an acher. Yeah. Right? Because the fact that it has to pass over the father to get her sounds like the father by right gets it, which means the daughters are really farther in a certain sense in Yerusha. But this seems to be the Gemara's question, which is, okay, we understand that sons come first. Does that mean that daughters are just like any other Yoresh? Or is it that no, daughters are Mamali Makom, it happens to be that sons are better Mamali Makom, but daughters are also Mamali Makom and therefore can redeem your land and make it not go to the Kohanim. Right? So what does the Gemara say? But Ma'ushatamid Sadeh Le'aviha, can a daughter keep it in her father's property? And how does it frame its conceptual question? Chevan Dili'inyon Yibom Benuvana Tiadade Patre Mukma. Do you say, well, the evidence from Yibum, where sons and daughters are equal, prove that she's actually like a son for these purposes? She's Mamale Makom, or whatever you want to say, and therefore if she redeems the land, it does stay within the family. Right? It doesn't go to the Kohanim and Yibum. O Dilma, or do you say, Chevan in the Nachala, Bat Mamakom Ben, Ki Achar Dama Lomok, more do you say, well, in the end of the day, the fact that a son comes before the daughter for inheritance shows that sons are qualitatively different than daughters, and that carries over to the case of Se'al Chuzah. Meaning, Yibum, at first, remember, this is the tension we started with yesterday, that the case of Yibum indicates that daughters are Mamale Makom. The case of Yerusha at first glance implies that it's not. And therefore we said, well, you could get out of it by saying that, no, daughters are really like sons, they just happen to come later in the process. Or you say that Yibum is more expansive because it's about having any sort of legacy, but not really a Mamale Makom, or whatever you want to say. But the Gemara is now putting this straight to you, which is, the case of Yibum implies that daughters are Mamale Makom. The case of Yerusha implies that they are, at least the simplest understanding, that they do not. So which one is the rule
and can therefore define what we do for the case of Se'achuzah. What's the Gemara's answer? Tashma, Titana to be Rabbi Ishmael, Kol Shu Acher B'makom Ben. All you need is that she's someone else compared to the son. Hanami B'makom Ben, when it comes compared to the son, Ki Acher Damya. She is an Acher. That's what you learn. Right? You need someone that is an acher compared to the son. Meaning, in the end of the day, no, she really... Now, you could read it very limited if you wanted, which was, she really is like the father, just not as much like the father as the son, right? But I think at some point you have to say that there's enough proof.
I could be like misunderstanding this, but actually it seems to say that she's an acher, with respect to these brothers, although I don't know, seemingly that it sure wasn't.
But again, you could read this in a very limited way, which is to say she's other, but only compared to the son, but really, otherwise, she's not other, right? And for some reason, by Se'achuzah, you need the least not other person that there is, which is only a son, right? But that formulation at some point gets convoluted, right? So the other way of reading it is, no, this is the Gemara saying, yeah, a son is your continuation in a direct way, and anybody else, they are your heirs and stuff like that, but they're not sons.
It's a little bit of
I mean, she is an heir, but she's not an heir when they're sons. But it sounds like this is even more. Now, however, there is a slight ambiguity in this Gemara. Slight ambiguity, which is the following. What's the ambiguity? Is the Gemara talking about a case where there are sons or not?
That's what I meant to...
Right? Meaning, you could say, look, maybe the Gemara is only concluding, right? Spell it out for me, Rami.
This is what I meant. So the way that it works in case, it seems to say that so relative to the brother, and there's
Good. So Rami picks up on the last ambiguity here, which is maybe the real question is as follows. If there is no son, so then she's not an acher, and then she indeed could redeem it. The Gemara's question is much sharper, which is if there are sons alive, which means that in practice, she's not going to be the Mamali Makom. Does the fact that in potential, she could have been the Mamali Makom if there weren't sons, is that enough for the purposes of Se'achuzah for her to redeem it? Okay? One more time. I'm going to try that one more time because I see blank looks. Try it one more time. Right? The Gemara is not clear. Does the Gemara mean that if there are sons who are alive, and therefore in practice, the sons are the ones who are going to inherit and the daughter isn't, which is not a controversial statement, therefore, the fact that the daughter in theory could be her father's Mamale Makom when there aren't sons is irrelevant, because now there are sons, and therefore she's not going to inherit, so her status is therefore diminished, and therefore it's not just diminished for Yerusha, but it's diminished for the case of Se'achuzah as well. Or do you say what, Rami? That no, the fact that when there are sons she's shoved to the side proves that even when there are no sons, her inheritance is of a lesser level, and therefore even if this particular father has no daughters, has no sons, and only daughters, and they are the heirs, she still can't redeem the land, because the fact that when there are sons, she's second to the sons, proves that her inheritance is not as strong as that of sons, right? It's ambiguous, right? And therefore, to really figure out whether you think that daughters are lesser heirs, you have to figure out, when the Gemara excludes daughters from buying back the land, does that mean daughters when there are sons who are alive? Or does that mean daughters even when there are no sons and she will be the heir? If it's the latter, then that really, really proves that even when daughters inherit, they are not as good as sons, right? They're not as good heirs as sons. But if the Gemara is only telling you that if sons happen to actually exist, then daughters can't redeem the field because there's someone closer than them, that doesn't prove anything about what happens when there are no daughters. There are no sons, right? So in this case, the truth is that the Gemara does not tell you which one it's talking about. I gave you just at the top of the next page that Rabbi Yashiv comes down hard following the Minchas Chinuch. He was shorter than Minchas Chinuch, so I just gave you his one line, which is, Bat ma'u shetamid lavia, nira dini bailu af makom she'ein ben. Vabat vada yoresha. The Gemara's question is in what case? When there are no sons. Even when there are no sons, and the daughter will be the heir, she's still an acher. And therefore she can't redeem the field. So, the Minchas Chinuch, which Rabbi Yashiv quotes, finally, right, we have a pretty clear answer, at least for one shita, which is, what does the Minchas Chinuch clearly believe? What is the upshot of all these sugyot? That even when daughters inherit, they're just another heir. They're not the son. But, as Rami notes, that takes an assumption in the Gemara, which is that the Gemara is talking about a case even when there are no sons alive. And the daughter is the heir. But you could, in theory, have read the Gemara as saying only when there are sons actually alive, then the daughter doesn't have the ability to redeem the sadeh and keep it in her father's possession. But maybe if there are no sons and she will be the heir, then that's not the case. Right? The Minchas Chinuch comes hard on one side, but it's not clear because of that ambiguity in the Gemara, which is what Rami picked up on, which is how literally do you read b'makom ben? Yes, that's right.
There's multiple
There are multiple sons, what?
then, like, non-firstborn is able to redeem it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what I conclusively say, based on all this so far, is that the Minchas Chinuch's read of the Gemara in Erchen comes down on the side that daughters, even when they inherit, are not malei makom. Yes?
Yes.
That I can come down and say pretty clearly conceptually. If that's the only way to read the Gemara, no, we've rated, right? Again, we've noted that maybe not. So, then I gave you all Tosudim on Daf Kuftet, because all the Tosudim on Daf Kuftet seem to be struggling through this issue. I know, I gave you a whole umbrella of Tosud. Wow. But let's...
It's like airing at them like.
What?
How it's airing at them like that. It's like that. It's like that. It's like
Well, we'll see what Tosud says. I'm not going to... But Tosud seems to be struggling with this question throughout the whole umbrella. So let's try to quickly, I know this is a lot of Tosud, but let's try to at least quickly read through it. Okay? I won't make you read it. Right, since for the case of Yibum, sons and daughters are the same. V'im Tomar. How do you know that daughters even exempt you from Yibum? If it's from Uben Elo Ayin Mamzer, the Gemara in Yevamo teaches you that includes a Mamzer for exempting you from Yibum. How do you know it exempts daughters? The Yesh Lomar, the Shkulin, we have, right, the answer is the Shkulin, we have Oshnehem. He said, Mamzer, the fact that Mamzer and a daughter exempt from Yibum are for the same reason, which is you have a child. So, just from that line, Joseph, what does he seem to think? Are daughters equivalent to sons? No, because his point is that daughters are just, meaning, Ayenalav, the fact that we expand the notion of what counts as a descendant, right, just proves that everybody gets in that category. Daughters, moms there, doesn't matter who it is, right? Meaning, it doesn't prove that they're like sons, it just proves that for the purpose of Yibum, we're more expansive. The Alpha Gav the Perigamon going Dodo Gavi Zerave Ain Lo Debat going to Israel Mashmad Lo Dashimine Tarde, the Gomor Ain Lielazara Zera Minayin, Tamalomar Zera Ain Lami Komakom, Ain Lielazara Kosher Zera Baguminayin, Tamalomar Zera Ain La, even though in another case we need separate drasho to teach all of those halachot, grandchildren and mamza, etc. Uparaga Vikul Zera Zara Ain Mishum, Dimikarve Atam Zera Paso, Ain Zera Zera Paso. Right? He goes through a whole analysis where in other areas of halacha, we in fact do need two drashot. Here, you don't. Inami Rabot Basha with Termina Yibo, Milo Yimache, Prat Lazesh, Ein Shmo Machui. He said, look, at the end of the day, the reason mamzer might need a special limud is because the whole point here is not to erase somebody's name, and maybe you wouldn't have known that having a mamzer still gives you a legacy. Okay. V'im tomar haditani parakama dikidushin evet ivri oved aben lein oved abat. Evet ivri case that we saw in Kiddushin, that only sons and not daughters can have the evet ivri work for them. But amai. Name Amila Dilanian Ibum Benuba Kiadodin, you know, Hanamil and every Kizamrin and Achal and Yanakala. Midixeva Kajation and the Masnal of Yori Loman Elachdafka. I said, but wait a second. Evan Ivri, why do we exclude daughters? Why don't we use Yibum to prove that they're equivalent? I mean, what does he seem to be asking? Doesn't Yibum prove that Ben and Bat are both your rightful heir? In the same way, and therefore it should carry over to Evet Ivri and Zachuza and all that stuff. Answer: no. The pasuk there is it serves you. L'cha v'lo la'acher, you and nobody else. Kol shehu acher ligabe ben. It's anyone who is an acher compared to a ben. Uvat nami ligabe ben ke acher damyan la'inyan nachala. Right, what does he say? The case of Nachala proves that daughters are Acher Lagabe Ben. Right? Meaning that doesn't seem to be a localized thing. It seems to be making a statement. Now again, you could read it locally and say, no, she is a Mamali Makam, but not as much as the son. But his point is that the case of Nachala isn't just an example. It's a conceptual paradigm, just like Yibum is. Right? It's not just an exception. It's a paradigm. The high governor in Paragon Magician Gabe Akuza. The bat Aina Mamed Sadelavia, Mishum Dichi Hechi, the Gabe Nachla, Bat Lagabe Ben, Akardamia, Linian Serhuzanami Akardamia. Just like by inheritance, the daughter is an Acher, by Serhuzan, she's an Acher. Again, can I prove that Tosfot thinks that that's even when sons are alive? No. But his language indicates to me that Minchas is probably right. Which is that Tosfot sees all these Gemaras as setting up an alternate paradigm. That Yibum is one type of paradigm where the standard is just, do you have any legacy? And then Nachala, Evet Ivri, Serchuz is another paradigm, which is not just, do you have any legacy, but do you have the ultimate heir? Again, I can't prove this what he means, but his language consistently seems to be making that conceptual move, that Nachla isn't just some exception to the rule, it is a rule. It's a paradigm. The next does it also. B'makom barat amaver Nachla min ha'av, peir rivam is lo k'tiv u'nitatem gabe bat, k'dichtiv b'kul. Since it doesn't say give by daughter as it does everywhere else, havartem mashron lashon ha'avara, shema'avirin Nachla mimakom ha'ra'ui, lirosh min hadin. He says, how do you read the word b'havartem? Listen to his language. You take it away from the person who inherits by right, to a place that's not proper. Meaning, how does he understand the Gemara pretty clearly? Right? Or diuk. So what do you learn from the words V'ha'avartem? That at some level, fathers really deserve it more by right. And giving it to a daughter is the halacha, but it's not the right thing at some deep level. It's not the just thing to do.
I mean, I would like to put a little bit, onto that, what is it?
And he says, why? And he tries to figure out who's this closer person. Why? Because, why should it go to the father? What's the argument? What does Tosfos say? Because the son who died comes from his father. Meaning, what does Tosfos seem to believe? That the closest relatives are fathers and sons in either direction. And therefore, giving it to a daughter, you do it, but, right, his language is pretty strong. It's not min hadin, it's not just. Right, because at some level, your father is really closer to you. What? And that's a good question, right? Meaning, what does it mean it's not just? The Torah said it. Is the Torah saying something not just? Possibly, right? The Torah is telling you we're overriding what would be true by natural justice in favor of something else, right? But Tosfos' language really does seem to push them in chinuch directions. That we learn from this that fathers and sons in both directions are more naturally related than daughters.
So you see through where the halacha was introduced is that it doesn't follow the laws outright. It says it accepts them as a given and then alters them. So it's just based off of how normative human behavior.
Right, and look, he contrasts and he says, right, what we learn is that this is from the father, but not the ach, but the ach does not come tachat aviv, right? Tachat achiv, right? Meaning brothers were obvious. Again, I can't prove it, but again, his language, Tosfos' language does push in the direction that he's introducing a paradigm consistently throughout. Right, and that daughters, according to this paradigm, are just not as much heirs as sons, and that's what everything flows from. Right, that does seem to be the direction Tosfos is taking. And if you look at the last Tosfos, he says, "Klomar midiloktiv ela va'avartam echad ein lanu lasot ela avar achad lo shtaim." You only do one passing over, not two. Mikan va'elach hakarav karav kodem, and from then on, the closer relative is first, which means, right, he's very clear in how he makes the Gemara. That the conclusion of the Gemara is that who's closer, the father or the daughter? The father. Meaning, according to Tosfos, it's not that the fact that you give it to the daughter teaches that you were wrong in thinking the father is closer than daughter. You were right. It's just that the daughter comes before father, and that's the only violation of Hakarav Karav Kodem. Right, that's how Tosfos, one second. That's how Tosfos reads it. I'm just telling you Tosfos reads the Gemara, which means that according to Tosfos, what does he seem to think by the end of the day? Right, he says, the father comes before the daughter, or should have come before the daughter, and definitely before the brother. Daughters are closer than brothers, but implying not fathers. Right, but Havartim teaches you that a daughter is not closer than a father; she just inherits anyways. Va'odin yibum makom bat, and it's a technicality. The yibum doesn't happen with a daughter. Lefich in lahaver nakom navel makom bat lechudei came to chniv havar v'lakom lachon. Right, but the way it doesn't reach our Gemara is that not that the Gemara is teaching you that it's untrue. The daughters really are closer than fathers. He's saying no, that's not true. Fathers really are closer than daughters. It's just that it's exered katuv. The daughters inherit first.
How does he determine that fathers are closer?
Again, I don't know who he determines. I'm asking you how he reads the Gemara. This is Rami. This is how he reads the line to Gemara that taking it from the father and giving the daughter is a ha'avara. Right? Why? So you could have said that because you might have thought that fathers are closer than daughters. Kamash one, daughters are closer than fathers. But that's not how Tosfos reads it. Tosfos says, you might have thought that because fathers are closer than daughters, they inherit first, Kamash Malan, even though fathers are closer than daughters, daughters inherit first. That's how Tosfos reads it. Right? You didn't have to read it that way. But Tosfos does read it that way. And therefore I think that in the end of the day, the reason that, I think what leads to a read like the Pinchas Chinuch, which in the end of the day, I think is probably the better read of the Sugyot. Again, in each case you could negate it, but I think it's probably better, and it's almost definitely what Tosfos meant, right, and how Tosfos read the Sugyos, is that in the end of the day, yes, daughters are heirs, but they are not heirs in the way that sons are, right? It's almost, look, Minchas going to definitely think that's the conclusion of the sugya. Tosafot almost definitely, I think, thinks that's the conclusion of the sugya. I'm not saying it's impossible to read it that way. We'll see that there are other Shita and Rishon. And what we're going to do tomorrow is see that the Rajba and the Shita Lami seem to have a machloket of whether this is in fact what we learn from the case of Eved Ivri, or maybe maybe we misunderstood the whole sugya, and in fact, Eved Ivri teaches that the daughters are the same as sons. And we'll see one more example where this comes up in the Yad Ramah, and a bit of analysis from Reb David Povorsky. If you don't read that inside, that's not such a big deal. Okay, so we'll polish this off tomorrow. Yes, Ezra. Okay. Polish off. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow's your colleagues.